Hello everyone, today we talk about the ars dictaminis from 11th to 13th century Italy, the art of writing in essentially the most literate region of medieval Europe, and in the one experiencing in fact the greatest civil, administrative, bureaucratic, statal, kind of also tax, kind of juridical development in the same continent. So this aspect is crucial. We will look at other, let's say, in other videos about things like the reflection on the art of government, the practice of eloquence, rhetoric, the propaganda in art, for example. The beginning of political art as such, actually, the great, even iconographic programs that you can still admire in some great halls of public palaces of priors, of communal Italy, the palace of government, fundamentally. And this topic intertwines as well, unavoidably, with, in fact, the political involvement, right? So civic education, but also an private enterprise, learning, interest, curiosity, and so on. Right? I'm always fascinated by the text, the fabric of faith, in a way, as every time I find these topics randomly, I realize that they always are connected with one another. Just yesterday we were talking about Frederick II's imperial majesty ideology, which tells you already a lot, right? Even though focused strictly on the figure of the emperor, but fundamentally of how deeply intertwined was with local policy. Here we talk about essentially not just communal Italian ars dictaminis, but more in general with also the human resources, if you want, the individuals, the places that provided with the scholars that were not necessarily always in a communal context, right? We made lots of videos about the Italian communes, and there is a submerged part of this, because mostly we identify naturally central and northern Italy as this substantially homogeneous space that in fact remained so historically to that standard level of development, exactly because of the spread of the communal phenomenon, because of the structure of the Italic kingdom. Then there is also a central southern dimension, right, that overlaps in the center, as you understand, but that is also connected with a communal development that we hardly talk about. I don't know if I'm ever even going to talk about communal southern Italy, because it's one of those topics that are not really there, because we are very differently documented about the southern kingdom for obvious reasons, in part because it was a feudal system, right? And so we have, generally speaking, the cities that were there were also pretty large, right? They had all a development historically, technically, also in terms of republicanism. They had been ahead until the 11th century. Even part of the 12th, even to the same northern ones. You know, the first maritime republics were from southern Italy, and that eventually, just with the Normans, we have kind of a pressure brought by the feudal monarchy to the extent of a bit obscuring what was happening in this otherwise, however, very populated, not as much comparatively like the north and even the center, but still by European standards dramatically populated and rich region, which fundamentally had its communal life, but it is not documented through statutes. We have problems reconstructing. We know basically nothing of it. We know it was there. We have great proofs of that kind of civil development as well, but not to the degree would essentially equate the north. still in the way it would be able to provide with an educated personnel with. This is the importance of Italy, of laymen, right? You know that the term clerk in medieval Europe is used because as a synonym of administrator, just because we essentially, like, this comes from Ayra's language, like think about England herself, where this thing spread from, also in the historiographical dictionaries, let's say, the idea that the only educated people were the clergy, right? And so that feudal monarchies especially would function mostly with people coming from the clergy, especially, say, up till the High Middle Ages. The case of Italy is instead one of the most precocious of lay education, administration, and this we've seen from many different videos about medieval Italy. We have a pretty hefty playlist about that, and that's also one of the reasons why we have to come back looking at it. Just to make an example, as I was saying at the beginning, this how, say, the arts dictaminis with together with rhetoric, etc., intertwined with so many topics. There is that series I made in 2021 because of the 700th anniversary of Dante's death. That is essentially 5 videos about the poet, and who was, and that's the point, actually much more than a poet. He was actually a knight, a moneylender, a diplomat, a statesman, even an ambassador, and also a poet, not just a poet, but as far as his literary production was concerned. He wrote treatises, etc. So that was in many ways the peak of medieval civilization. And of course, Dante is a special figure. His Florentine background and origin is, he's also exceptional in his own way, because Florence definitely had a peculiar development, still, like every commune did, one way or another, in spite of the similarities, but definitely as far as the arts, civics, let's say, literature, that started properly humanism, the Renaissance. And you can't really see, looking at this Italian Middle Ages, like a moment in which this thing was kind of not there, which the cities had been dormant, right? That thing we said about southern Italy in many ways can be applied also, to the same Italian cities to some point. That I made multiple videos stressing how much continuity actually from Roman times exists in southern Europe, and especially in a country like Italy, but not just because of the obvious, Roman, being the obvious Roman cradle, just also for a specific municipal culture that is the one that eventually is expressed in the communes, that had been the pillar for any ruler in the peninsula from the Longobards, that developed this, in fact, urban, civic, highly literate juridical system on the basis of what the Romans still had there, even after the Gothic War. The same thing was kept being subsidized by the Teutonians. I mean, of course, what happens starting from the 11th century is not, as we have been told, like in general, even about the Dark Ages, that at some point Europe blossomed out of nothing, right? That a time of terrible darkness and unknown things. This is a very, it derives. I'm not going to digress on it, but of course it starts from mostly the concept, the approximation that after the Western Roman Empire, everything was like, it was a sort of, dramatic, holocaust of everything, literally, and everything ended, was destroyed, crumbled, whatever, and nothing happened for 500 years, and some people, extend this even to the entire medieval millennium, up until somebody broke a manuscript somewhere, and everything, the Renaissance happened, technology happened, science happened, the Enlightenment happened, because there are people who actually literally believe this, and of course I'm talking about actual adults who vote, adults who have children, adults that can, drive cars, right? So just know that we're surrounded, they live among us, right? And they're probably the majority of people. And and this is a huge problem as far as any political, military, or social understanding of Western history, identity, civilization, and beyond is really concerned, right? So you wonder, talking about the ars dictaminis, how much we have to stress. I admit this video is a bit of a pretext to say all these other things, because there's not really a huge amount of things. Like, we're not talking about the art now per se and how it unfolded. We're talking about something a bit more political and a bit less technical. Of course, at some point, I don't know, if you're particularly interested in it, I doubt, because, I somehow guess correctly what you're more or less interested in. But, if you're interested, I can deal with lots of things in detail. I can get you the most updated, conclusions we have achieved historiographically. But this is what I enjoy on Schwerpunkt is dimensioning history, especially as the civilizational meaning is involved and scale, but concretely speaking, not an ideal abstract thing. I think this is the main strength of Schwerpunkt, among the other things, that gives you like a sort of thermometer of providing you with, again, absolute standards of reference as a sort of compass of what was happening in the world at the time, how, where, why, and just how the thing really took form. So the art of writing, and we will keep digressing again, likely, is the ars dictaminis is the art of knowing how to essentially to write a text, right? It's that simple. The dictamen would be the dictate, right? What was historically, great thinkers, philosophers, whatever, had their own, mostly, as you will understand here, all the models, especially in the West, were Roman, were Latin. So were people that were literally dictating to their scribes that were like servants or something. This concept, again, in a moment of great revival of literary activity, of monetary economy, of transactions, of political relations, of, let's say, revival of universal power as much as the city-states, and so it was crucial in everything. It was an eminently, the medieval one was a brutally and traumatically and overwhelmingly written culture, right? There is nothing, say, more exemplary of medieval inexhaustible medieval thirst of knowledge as, the great medieval libraries, against any silly prejudice about the idea that, libraries that where people didn't go, right? Don't confuse medieval libraries with libraries of Alexandria, where literally nobody ever went to read anything, because they were just huge magazines, let's say, that nobody really frequented, if not a handful of court literates just for consulting a minimal part of it and mostly carrying out 90% philological research. Like in the West, the Romans actually went to the libraries, the rough Romans, the primitive Romans actually went to the libraries for reading, or to have somebody reading for them publicly, and were much more active. Like the West had a much greater vivacity in terms of manuscript exchange than the East. There's no doubt about this during the early Middle Ages. I mean, the way knowledge was salvaged, copied, etc., it's all something that was documented at the time. It's not just that we get to know that from the later times, it's just that the Arab world, the Byzantine world, were not so interested in critically analyzing the knowledge per se. They were just mostly interested in storing and kind of using it, if anything, to maintain it, for sanctioning a kind of a established order of sort that would endlessly sclerotize even the access to. This depends on different issues. Mostly they're political. In fact, they intertwine also with the broader cultures and religions at the time. Islam surely influenced this process for for the Arab world, the Byzantine Caesar papism definitely did its work on its own. So I'm not going to digress in this, but again, we should really shake off ourselves this idea that the West somehow stalled at a point, or that there was something about the relation with cultured knowledge, the written word, that at some point had stopped and somebody had to revive. The West always continuously salvaged this knowledge, stored it, but also used it, analyzed it, used it to compose other things, to just be out there and doing things with that, right? Sometimes even very practical things, we're not politically speaking, right? That naturally reflected the degree of competition existing in the West between the various poles, but it's something that, however, stimulated the civilization per se. So, as we were saying before, Italy had, I think, by far the highest literacy level in the world, right? I don't think this was, like no other country had the level of wealth distribution in the world to properly afford a substantial amount of laymen to be properly free citizens in free city-states, to build their own state according to their own law, right? Even in relation to imperial, to universal power, right? This is something really unique in the way it came to manifest as a synthesis of civilization, fundamentally, of culture, of education, of wealth, of self-awareness, right, of identity, right? We've explained in multiple videos that these lands were essentially some that had always believed that they had the right of being free. There was some degree of nobility that they owned just because they were free in arms, and that was the main indicator of it. And the Communes, I made a video about that, had an eminently military foundation and civic meaning, right, and political aggressiveness as well. And none of this, not things like the humanism and the Renaissance could have been possible without that, right? Mostly, we approach a bit like the idea is the Middle Ages. Dark Ages for everyone, guys. Then there is a moment of the Renaissance. There are these weird Italians that created, cool stuff like paintings and churches and stuff. But at the end of the day, they were just something else. And then the nations came, took over, also Italy, and Italy then was just a decadent thing throughout all its own history. This is most of the picture that we get now, and of course, skipping especially the first part, it renders impossible to understand the Middle Ages, and together with it, basically the entire global history. Because seriously, what's the point for you to studying, Native American history or Chinese history if you do not know European history? It doesn't make any possible logical sense, right? At least there is a preeminence, right? A record, a primacy, a superiority of Western civilization that cannot be ignored by saying, well, it's just because we speak from it. Really? Can you point at me where this was happening in the rest of the world? Because, I'll take note in case, right? And this is not due to, still other countries haven't done their work in academia because they are other, underdeveloped, or they're communist, or whatever else kind of civilization. Yeah, even speaking of civilization is bold there. But in that sense, right? What do you think the world is like? That there is a huge fog that we do not know things, that we have to guess. Well, usually people will still have to learn things for reasons like that. Then everything more or less in terms of general, essential, fundamental notions about the development of civilization is pretty well known, right? Unless you prove to me that before the Ice Age it was a submerged civilization that we know nothing of. Okay, that I can, even without buying all those bullshit from Graham and that is not a serious thing, right? It's just a complete delusion that could even be based on something real, except this is not being fundamentally outlined. That's just an idiot that absolutely does not know even remotely what the meaning of history or logic or science or morals really is, and just sells books for the lesser people, the undereducated, the fourth estates, the new slaves of the third millennium, and we're definitely not interested in that. Here we're talking about having in front of us the pillars of world civilization and basically not giving a fuck because you do not have an adequate parental upbringing, your school sucks, and not university professors, a bunch of twisted Marxists you got the picture here. Well, this is the problem, right? It's as if you sat on a shitload of money and nobody ever told you, and you died poor with the money right there. That's how you should be seeing Western history in the first place. There is no way around that. There is not the possibility, given what we know in terms of civilizational output, of historical documents, and possible documentation, because that's always a thing in history, that this is like just something you can make moral relativism around. This is not actually how it works. The main use of the art of writing was for political sake. You needed essentially to be politically eloquent, right? And what is fascinating about this is that it's not mere rhetoric or oratory art specifically, but only at least, which existed. And unfortunately, we cannot document a great deal because, of course, politics were really done orally at the time, also through the non-written, of course. But it's obvious, first of all, yes, we can draw from the Ars Dictaminis a lot from it, but in the first place, we're talking about a written culture. That politics was done by people who wrote and read, right? This is the crucial aspect. And this was the hub of it all, right, regionally speaking. It consisted, first of all, in the drafting of letters, talking about mail, right? So most of, again, if you look at, for example, we saw it in detail, in parallel, the governmental development of Italian communes is one in parallel with one another, right? You can't say, well, these were all different, fragmented, disunited. They evolved literally. They had institutions, followed the timeline of the consuls, of the podestas, of the people government. They were all in the same moment, right? And they functioned all in the same way. So behind that, of course, there was a massive, and we know that because the offices were often also at a point foreign, right? The people came from different cities. They had connections with them of any kind, because these people were within the same clans that made war as much as they made trade. They invested in farming, specialized crops, and all this stuff. They traded a lot. They traveled a lot, right? They went abroad a lot, right? And it's obvious at that point you just must know how to read, right? Not just in write, not just in Latin, but also in other languages, right? I made videos in the early days about also a bit how science worked at this time. People traveled in multiple countries at a time, and here the fascinating aspect that you wonder why cities like Florence, for example, came to be what they would, is that these were private people. Nobody was really sending them. Yes, sure, sometimes they work for big people. They, as we will see now, they work for the emperor, for the pope, or whatever. But mainly, like, they could be like Dante, going to Paris, like, for just on his own, with his own resources. There were noblemen, fundamentally landowners, etc. But they would do that because they knew that would give them prestige, because cultured people at the time were powerful. Right, knowledge was, we've seen it with jurists, they were equated to knights. They had they had the same privileges of knighthood, not just like the knights. They were literal knights by law, by status, social status, were recognized as such. And beyond, they were also read, right? In the sense that, if you wrote a juridical treatise or one in political theory, etc., chances were that you would be read by kings, and especially if you were the top, right? If you had this great education. So the enormous amount of wealth they could invest in education is just like the paradise, literally, of the scholarly ideal, if you wanted. This all before humanism in the, say, late medieval Ancien Regime sense came in, when it was essentially just lords that paid a guy for staying at their court for researching, and that's it. A bit like more in the Hellenistic time. Here we're talking again, like free citizens of free communes that live in the world where they met. In the world meant as the empire, as Christendom, as Europe, right? All things that have taken shape by now in an indissoluble way, right? And this is the reason why political epistolary especially required a theory, right, to teach how to write, right? Thus, the application of the expression ars dictaminis, right? The fact that you had literally to train in this art to be good at it, like any other thing, right? Just think about the guilds. Everybody had their own specialized craft for something. You would learn how to be a banker, how to be a notary. In this case, you had to learn how to write political stuff. It's just like political pamphleteering, political commentaries, right? So in our world, we're all aware of that, except at the time, there were intelligent people doing differently from the wide majority of today. And what especially the masses think, qualitative political insight really is, right? So at the top of a differentiated typology of texts, let's say the diplomas were located, right? The diplomatic letters, right? That were essentially those documents exchanged within the communes, the princes, and the other great of the earth. That again flowed dramatically at this point. Just yesterday, think about that political propaganda we've seen before by Frederick II, the one put against him by the papacy, etc. Just think about the sheer massive investment, right? For having just somebody could be so educated to refine, develop, perfection the imperial ideology or the papal ideology, right? It needed to make sense in a world that didn't quite have like a fixed law. This is particularly interesting. Like you have the revival of Roman law. You have especially the emperors interested in that because they can kind of claim that they're superior also to the church in any earthly matter during the investiture controversy. But de facto, even when that was recovered, there were lots of other laws going on. Again, there were the ethnic laws of the various countries, mostly dating to the Romano-Germanic times. Then you had feudal law that had grafted on that, so the laws that had been issued by the local kings, by the emperors. Then there was this reinjection of Roman law, and a lot of philological inquiry on essentially not much to recover these laws as sources of law itself, but rather studying them in order to understand the reason behind them, and not again to take them as standards that had to be simply transplanted in their own reality, right? That's actually a typical contemporary thing. Look at what they tried to do during the French Revolution, failing. That is to say, trying to copy how the Greeks or the Romans each other in, 8th, 19th century France, right? But in this, especially in this moment, medieval history, like trying to solve problems practically, was an eminently positive undertaking. It was aimed at making things work, also with an important degree of innovative way, by adapting it to the circumstances, right? The ancient Romano-Germanic laws were not enough to regulate the enormous flow of wealth, right? Regulating property, taxes, trade, etc. So they had to recover something bigger, something more Sata-like. So drawing mostly from the Roman law, that was a particularly sophisticated thing with the institutions, etc. And at the same time, however, considering that the system was not based on Roman law as such, and that there were certain specific prerogatives of which all these communes, for example, were extremely jealous of, as you understand, which, however, had to be declined in that world. Again, I don't have a medieval law playlist, but I have to create it because there is a great deal there of, probably an outlook on the world, right? Made videos also on the crisis of the universal institutions in the mid-14th century, the last universalist theorists, and so on. But let's put it in this way: until the 13th century, people still believed in it, still believed that the world was that big, universal, traditional symbol that worked in an imperial, ecumenic, Catholic fashion that basically was the real deal, in which everybody would have always liked to live. Right then, other ideas kicked in. People began to fail as themselves, and to cause the disgregation of the system in which we still live. And you can perceive properly that from in terms of political theory, in terms of their artists, the scolarization, if you want, the crisis of medieval civilization, and the opening into another dimension. But I'm not going to discuss that specifically. So these letters, these diplomatic letters, were not just aimed at having a dialogue with somebody who lived somewhere else, but especially they had the function of rendering public a sort of any kind of position, any kind of decision. Right? They had to convince, to argument, to affirm, right? Either a political program, right? Thanks to the circulation of the letters themselves, and or at least a view on the thing that had to, in fact, still reinforce that political predicament, right? So they were sometimes even conflictual. There were certain literary genres that were known as the tenzoni, for example, that were practically designed to attack one another, also in a, not necessarily in a political sense, but still in a way that had to expose, to criticize each other's worldview, political beliefs, whatever. And that were a bit of a joke sometimes, but they were still kind of real, right? There was how they debated politically at the time. Of course, most of this stuff would occur publicly with real debates that often equated, in a world where people, could make a coup, could make a revolt in the city, etc. So something much more, just the continuation of politics with other means, as we know. But there was naturally an officiality in the exchange and in the quality of the certification of these letters. If they were written by great scholars, thinkers, teachers, doctors, they had a much greater value, and they would be used fundamentally as a sort of gold standard by the same rulers, right? In the Middle Ages, how do you basically take a political decision? How do you make something official? Of course, things are written, but they are also publicly, literally stated out loud in the presence of some witnesses that are the big, say, the intelligentsia a little bit, and or people worth of particular trust and faith, because they were great people, they were the head of great clienteles, they were, say, noblemen, say, rulers, the church, and beyond. But that thus would have had to certify, to spread further this knowledge. Again, everything circulated mostly by, at least with a degree of certainty, through these letters and not just through rumors, right? So actually the way we will explain it very often during the Middle Ages, knowledge, information, data, news traveled was pretty damn fast, right? Contrarily to what you have been told usually. Of course, the peasant at the outskirts of somewhere would have not known things because they didn't know what to do with that. But people who needed to know what was happening from the other side of Europe, because we see it, that kingdoms always did, knew these things in a very few time, some weeks at the longest. If those who wanted to know things paid and news arrived, right? They were certified. It was all a system of, in fact, certifying this information was quite advanced, right? And when you look at, generally speaking, medieval politics, you realize how fast, efficient, reasonable, lucid, iron, logical it really was, even with a communication system like that one. And that speaks volumes about the latter and the actual, in fact, value of the latter in the first place. Naturally, in a world that was particularly interested in past authorities, just because, right, as we've seen with Roman law, it was not a matter, say, when we speak Roman law here, we're talking not about, in fact, Cicero that we're going to discuss now because of the Ars Dictaminis, but as you know, the Justinian Code was essentially an elaboration and a compilation of the Theodosian Code. So it was something that surely drew back from older, jurists, also from the early empire, but in general it was something else created in late antiquity, or probably in a Byzantine world, that had also scarcely circulated in the same West, even though it had been issued with the Pragmatica Sanctio under Justinian in the same Italy. And in fact, I made a video about that because there is all an interest among paleographers, jurists, codicologists of how much the Corpus Juris Civilis had circulated, not just in Byzantine Italy, but a bit all around, because the idea is somebody would have been interested in it anyway, even though it wouldn't find an adequate way of application after a while, because of the political, social changes. And in fact, also in the Byzantine Empire, we'll have to make a video about that, things had already gone different, so that they had literally to reconstruct it in the West rather than, asking the Byzantines, because things had really changed dramatically there too by this point. So it's obvious that most of this work was done in Latin, right? Especially Italy had a vernacular which became a literary language very late in time, right? The, let's say, Old French, Old German, something that already by the 8th century, fundamentally, you have starting to be written down, right, as a literary language. The Italians were not just closer to Latin in their vernacular enough to, say, understand written Latin, also of higher, and older grammatical standards, but they simply, in fact, could afford the education to keep writing in Latin, right? So, in all this philological work that, as we've seen, had to do with the with law and its subtleties, etc., it's obvious that also classical works in general were recovered, and Cicero, who was a lawyer himself, was used essentially as the base of the Ars Dictaminis in the form of two treatises. At least we think that, because at least these treatises were attributed to him, right? A treatise on rhetoric, to whom, in fact, also the orators inspired themselves, but differently from the oratory art, this art, the writing art, results to have been widely practiced also during the early Middle Ages, and codified by an impressive literary system that flourished starting from the end of the 11th century, where, well, first of all, in Campania, interestingly enough, and especially in the land known as Terra di Lavoro, which is essentially the strip of that's a pretty fertile area that is called like that, like the working land between Rome and Naples, roughly, right? And that was quite productive in that sense. And eventually, that is at this point at the beginning of probably the communal age, with the institution of the consular regime in central northern Italy, especially in Bologna, for obvious reasons. Just again, the other random connections there. Days ago, we talked about the organization of university studies, starting from the one of Bologna that was the more developed, and for obvious reasons, this would be the one who would study Cicero's art of rhetoric within also the context of a juridical, the most important juridical studium in the world, essentially, and the first university in Europe, by the way. So just understand the centrality of this, right? How important it was to write politically, not just. But we were talking about doctors, even about, again, what could be the motivations for students, even to travel, to come from other countries in this place to be a lawyer. What were the advantages of that? Well, among the other ones we were talking about, it was just being very skilled in many fields in the first place, because naturally, being that educated in Latin at the time, just to understand to understand Roman law, the digestum, the codex, etc., would open you lots of gates, right? to put it this way. But especially, this was, as we've seen, a commune. It had a political, a military activity. It was part of the same time of the age of. It was, as we've seen, provided with the diploma by Frederick Barbarossa during the time of the wars with the Lombard League, where the Bologna also joined. So it's a highly dense moment. It's a highly concentrated amount of people, of wealth, of interests, of projects, right, of plans, of cooperations, of interactions, right? I'm not sure how well we have really began to address communal history, but it's something, again, that especially in the historical region series, we have to look at step by step, city by city, because otherwise, if we talk generically about this, it seems like, yeah, these things were happening, but which ones? We'll see which ones, right? These were the same, I don't know, think about the Battle of Fossalta in 1249. The Bolognese infantry would go out there without cavalry support across the river to face the cavalry of Heinz, the king of Sardinia, son of Frederick II of Hohenstaufen, and winning with the support of cavalry that arrived in the meanwhile. Never mind Bolognese cavalry, but still, community. As you know, the Heinz would be captured in the battle and imprisoned in Bologna. So it's kind of a sad story there. But just for saying, these were the people who could basically imprison the emperor's son, and the emperor not being able really to do much, if anything, because he died the following year, but that were that involved, right, internationally, right? So this tells you concretely what these people were up to in general, why they needed all these letters, all this writing capability. But what is interesting is the aforementioned reference to Campania during the 11th century. Now, the area, and I think I've never made a video about Campania per se. During this time, I think we made a video about the Neapolitan Studium under Frederick II. That is very important because it drew a lot from Bologna, or at least it created kind of properly a Sicilian university for the emperor in that ideological context we were discussing about today, about Frederick's imperial majesty. But say by the 11th century, this place pretty rich, like Campania historically had been, right? During this high Middle Ages, Campania was much more connected with the area of Rome, also linguistically, a bit like in ancient times, right? Modern times would be different. The modern Roman language is Tuscan, essentially. But at this time, it was a deep connection between Rome and the broader southern Italy, and especially Campania, because the papacy, we've seen it very often, had always had great interests and possessions in southern Italy, had always tried essentially to recover That's estates, were in another. At this point, they settled the Normans. Here, they gave them green light to reconquer Sicily. They basically, the kingdom created there was a vassal of the papacy. Maintaining this privilege were very important bishoprics, an enormity of them. Talk about tens, right, and tens, right. There are entire regions of Europe at this point have just a few bishoprics, right, and so this tells you how even just the need for administrating all this stuff would produce what are in fact called as dictatores, that is to say, those who dictate. Those scholars specialize in political writing, let's put it in this way. These were originaries from specific cities. They came a bit from, the area in general, but the most important centers were Capua. So this was an agricultural center. This is famous because there is a Roman amphitheater, the Roman bridge was in what had been the Campania Felix, right, in a very prosperous area. It was in ancient times. It also at this time didn't kid. Gaeta, that had been one of the early maritime republics, right, and Naples. So these had been duchies of the ex-Byzantine duchies, where Capo had been a Lombard principality in the interland, telling the truth. So this had been old centers of government in a way or another, right? So they had already their offices, their administrators, their, all the knowledge, the literacy, generally speaking, especially the coastal centers, were very trade involved. They had a communal government. They were also, generally speaking, open in this kind of Italian world projected towards the Byzantine one, like to letters, to culture, to this kind of also classical legacy of some sort, right? That would make them proficient for the use of political writing. And these people are called like the Campanian school. Even though it's a bit like there wasn't really a school per se, there were just people who had their own way of doing it that had similarities on the base of this territorial community, and that were substantially just pretty versed, as we've seen in this work. Initially, they had connection with the papacy, as we were saying, before in the 11th century, the Normans, etc., eventually with Frederick II, so with the consolidation also what had been the Norman Swabian Sicilian kingdom. And we can find a direct line, a fil rouge, also with in fact, Frederick's court at Palermo. Think about Petrus de Vinea, right, Pierre de Vigna is also kind of immortalized by Dante because he was claimed to have been a suicide because he may have plotted against Saint Frederick. He was obliged to kill himself or was taken out. In any case, we're talking about essentially the most important administrator of Frederick's kingdom of Sicily, right? And a person of, again, enormous wealth and enormous knowledge. Again, southern Italy had this pinch still of Greek communities and language, and even written culture as well, that could add the extra touch of classical knowledge. Considered that Greek at this point was not even in southern Italy, really studied in a comprehensive fashion, or it didn't properly have its own schools. We've seen the other day in the video about medieval libraries that yes, there were Greek manuscripts, the one of Dionysius Areopagus that was donated also in Carolingian times, maybe by a Byzantine emperor. It was very prestigious and would be very important also for actually the theory of Gothic art, as a matter of fact. But it was just an exception. In any case, these were, again, highly cultured areas, and they could provide with such high rhetoric functional to a political use. Importantly enough, Petrus Davina was also the not just the most famous representative of this, say, Southern school, but also the greatest helper, supporter of the emperor throughout his reign, except the end of the same Petrus, in the literally propaganda war that the emperor was leading against the Pope, right, that was doing the same thing. So we're talking about really the spokesman of the imperial authority of the emperor, and thus someone who had to know not just how to administrate somewhere, but literally to know what imperial majesty, as we've seen yesterday, really was. And so understanding the role of the empire in the world, the notions of justice weren't to a legitimate political legitimacy, of lawfulness, because that lawfulness, that was required really to administer that kingdom of Sicily. That was again also pretty rich, was seeing a lot of a high degree of centralization by the hand of Frederick, but was also suffering war with papal invasion at some point. So really politicians that knew that made also spokesmen, as orators, etc., politics in the deepest sense, right, in the most effective sense, not just representatively like panegyrists at the Byzantine court that still made politics concretely, but dynamic politics in the form of administration, of decisions, of reforms, of taxation, that were connected with judges, with tribunals, with tax collectors, even with military commanders, and so on. It could inspire naturally to they had the control over the administration was a complex thing, but the influence of these individuals could go as far as finances. So these would be the ones that, if you were a bit paranoid about being overthrown, you would mostly blame for. That's likely why Petrus had to go in that context, as dramatic as it sounds. So this is a phase. This is a world. Bologna, that we mentioned, is the other great fundamental place for the ars dictaminis. Here, the great masters teach, right? The doctors in law, as we've seen, are some of the most prestigious people living in medieval Europe. They are incensed. They really objectively mastered the craft, right? These are people who studied law for, as we've seen, 8 years. They had to basically learn the entire codex by heart, right? They had to be able to really apply everything. They had to teach themselves during the study. All again with the means of the time, not with the computer in front of you, not with reading here and there. We're talking about mostly mnemonically, and also being able to express yourself in a way that also, written one, of course, that would give certainty, validity. This was the role also of the notaries. That was a tremendously successful craft at this point. There were some places in Tuscany where, say, 40% of the population or more, or 60 if I'm not wrong in one case, even in the Nevele Valley, were there were families of notaries, right? This gives you an idea of how important the craft really was. Just like today, there is, even though there's a cadastre, is like everything regarding your income is registered by the state, whatever, but still you need, in order to sell stuff, to buy stuff, to give credit value to the act, to the contract, just by paying these people, because they must know that everything to be legal, in fact, lawful, fair, just. And these jurists, right, broadly meant, have thus also to, as we were saying before, have to make law themselves, right? They didn't just have to apply a code like today, that you're certain of, it's all standardized, there is no doubt about it, whatever. It, at least in common law countries, it's slightly different, but the fact it's almost the same thing. You have a specific jurisprudence, you have a specific, like, it's all very, very tightly regulated. At the time, most of this thing was in theory. These were the same people who were actually carrying that out. And so they had to also catch up with the times, as we've seen, because the 11th century was definitely not the 13th, and new forms of government, new ideas, new administrations, new establishments, ways how do you administer really a place, how to govern a place. There are things in 200 years that changed the face of Europe in a dramatic way, and these people had to run after this, and that's why they were also sought for so much. In the first half of the 13th century, which is the same age as we've seen of Frederick II, there is a Bolognese parallel art, right, that is basically entering service sometimes of the same Frederick or of the popes. We've seen that Bologna basically gets in papal hands at some point, so there was an archdeacon that had to properly control the masters, etc. There was a very important political power, because literally you had to nurture masters that were were making your own political point. They were supporting your prerogatives. Bologna herself had been contended until 1274, when it was properly papal states recognized by Rudolf of Habsburg, in fact, between the two universal authorities. And so they played a little bit shrewdly, as it's not until actually the mid-14th century that the Bolognese are fully part of the papal states, without too much possibility of saying otherwise, right? And the most important Bolognese masters in this sense are Guido Faba, that died around 1245, and that composed a Summa Dictaminis that consisted essentially of 300 model letters, right? Some even in vernacular, interestingly enough. So this was a point which, yes, Italian was starting to become a literary language proper, but it's mostly all Latin, right? And so these letters were some sort of samples to say, if you want to know how to write well, political stuff, you have to read all these letters that naturally contained also some kind of ideology, right? Which would be interesting to make a video about, but that were mostly a sample of writing, right? An example of writing skills, of rhetoric, of capacity, again, to convince, and so on. The other one was, and especially the most important, Buon Compagno da Signa, that was born around 1170 and died after 1240, of which we have 11 treatises, within which numerous models of letters are contained, just like in the other work, right? So all these figures, importantly enough, were properly masters of law, right? They taught at Bologna, right? So they were extremely prestigious and famed people. These were the ones who had to write political letters on the basis of what they knew juridically, right? I think this is crucial, right? It's not just about having a political idea and abstracting it just per se in a philosophical fashion. These people were talking about how to administer the state and why it had to be administered in that way, because these people studied not just an abstract law, but its own practical application, right? So something they literally had to find themselves solutions to, because their job was mostly to draw from all this enormous juridical tradition and saying, okay, let's see what, say, Roman law says about this, and so what feudal law does, and others, and let's try to sort them out, to sort the issue out in a way that makes sense. And so this is my opinion, and they could influence each other politically a lot, right? Because at that point you're literally discussing what power the emperor has to have, or what the pope has to have, and unsurprisingly, there was all an art of persuasion regarding it, which couldn't quite be, let's say, left aside by saying, well, I just say this in a vacuum and nobody will read. No, they necessarily had to write things, not just that made sense, that were based on law, but it also had to be explained in a way that would essentially be spoken in a non-juridical language, right? More in a rhetorical one, in a literary one. As we've seen, the model was Cicero. So that would make sense just in terms of logic and reason, and that would sound right fundamentally. To just to train people to think in the similar way, to argument in the same in a similar way, and establishing in the process a sort of shared language, right? Again, the fact, for example, that before Dante nobody had ever pushed the boundaries of Italian vernacular up to some dimension. Well, in his work, that was done exactly because it was understood that you could make people understand these things, because evidently people could now, and vernacular had reached a level of development that had acculturated itself to the same level of Latin fundamentally, and they could use it also in a more kind of extensive way as far as the population was concerned in practice. So the idea of a common language, right, or a common understanding of a sort of shared knowledge is of course what we experience today also in the academia. It's the idea that in order to be competent in a certain field, you can't just arrive and say, well, according to me it's like this, and you have not read, you have literally no idea what historiography ever said or how it works, or what, you've never been see what reviews of a work really are, what are the, what's the difference in quality between a work and another, thinking another, and how just some other mechanism in terms of personal interest or income or whatever can be connected with that. So this was a way to certify your own fitness in the job and in the craft, and how good, say, successful you could be in fact as a professional in these fields. It is for this reason that since then the function of the dictator, that is to say a communal chancellor, in charge of drafting the official correspondence, for example, the verbals of the councils, right? So in other words, the texts provided with greater political weight was imposed in the main communes, and often was entrusted to illustrious rhetors such as Rolandinus from Padua, that had been a pupil of Boncompagno da Segna, Brunetto Latini in Florence. It was Dante's teacher as well. And these people were of huge culture in the first place, of huge prestige. They were, again, Latini was famous abroad in France. People translated the Trésor also because he wrote in French as well. He was there, he taught there as well. I mean, we're talking about figures of Rolandinus in Padua, was yet another great jurist of the time. These people were really important in the society of the time, and involved, by the way, in quite dramatic moments in the political history of their cities. I mean, the Padua of Rolandinus is the one of Ezzelin from Romano that we mentioned here and there. I mean, a dramatic moment in the rise of a signory, of a Ghibelline's signory. And in Florence, there was exactly the same problem. There were an alternation of wealth and Ghibelline regime with exiles. These people governed the communes at that time, and they had dramatic stories. They were exiled, at that point. So it's just like Dante. Everybody knows the name because of the poet, whatever. But you realize that this guy was one of the rulers of Florence at a point, and that he had power literally over the exiles, and he exiled even some of his best friends because of civic necessity. All this stuff, in extremely tense moments during wars, invasions, clashes, all taking on essentially an international relevance, because the struggle between Guelphs and Ghibellines at that point had internationalized dramatically, and it was being fought in Italy also by essentially the Empire and France through these communes, right? So when we look at say every commune had a government, right? They had these councils fundamentally, and that deliberated whichever norm, and they had to communicate with other polities. So men as Rolandinus and Latini were called literally to be like, you have to be the one who has to write this down in the form that is proper, with the actual reference, the kind of the legal face of it, right? The fact that this is not written by people who are just wondering how to cope with an international situation. It really has to be, of course, faithful to the decision of the government, but still expressing it in a fashion that sounds lawful, sounds just harmonious, right? Because people were of enormous knowledge, right? Most of their work were some compendia of the, say, of encyclopedias of the time, right? So that's why they were also studied abroad and were particularly famous, because basically all the juridical theory came from the Bologna studium. Florence now, with men like Latini, was starting to be known, especially in France, like, things that really mattered a lot for models of government, etc., even in realities that were not communal, or not as communal, at least, as the Italian one. So the fame of these people was enormous, and in all of this, still, again, coming from backgrounds that were not framed in other kind of greater, different from Petrus Davina, for example, not just like being the chancellor of a great kingdom. But these were very powerful, especially very rich city-states, and on their own, however, among other 30 in the Italic kingdom. So they had their own great importance, because any foreign ruler interfering in their politics there was kind of international competition and internal factionalism connected with it. We made multiple videos about that, but the sense is that they were quite free from, in terms of their background, in order to gather an encyclopedical knowledge that nobody else had in their times. Who would these people be? You would think clergymen. No, they were just essentially citizens, right? People with land, with wealth, with status, right? But mostly an enormous personal and entrepreneurship, right? And kind of curiosity and intellectual activity, and being involved really in so many things at a time that you even wonder how they could find the time. When you look at Dante, you wonder what this guy, was in exile. He fought in numerous wars during this time. We don't even know what was happening. He was not really having even a lot together with him after he was exiled. Wherever he went was a turbulent place in a way or another. Surely he was supported, he received, like he was famous in these courts and whatever, but the question is, where did they find the time to create the greatest masterpiece of medieval civilization? And he didn't even want to go on with that at a point in his life. And who knows how many geniuses like him actually existed at the time and decided for a reason or another not to be in a world rather than another. Think about Petrarch later on, that studied law himself, but fortunately bailed out after his father died, just to become the man of letters, the humanist, the founder of humanism, telling the truth. So these stories would be quite frequent, but in a world that we would be appalled by in terms of the sheer scale of misery compared to our own. Again, these were the places in Europe with the greatest concentration of per capita, places in the world actually, in the specific case of Florence, with the highest concentration of per capita wealth, but still, for our standards today, I mean, the misery of it would have shocked us. And how, especially, this is what really, I think, is really moving and meaningful and deep in this, is how much these people cared about knowledge in a world like that, right? This is the counterintuitive thing, that people were much more intelligent, of course, than us today, even though they had literally nothing of what we have today in terms of knowledge, of information availability. And of course, we have completely stopped to care about it in the first place, right? Just, who cares, right? These people would have given everything to understand. And they really brought Western civilization to a level that, again, truly at this point, nobody else could compete with. So my point here is, first of all, always try to relate yourself to them. Don't think that you're anything special, because you're not. Just think, if you want a standard about these people, just try to picture all the implications of what we said today. You wonder, probably since the beginning of at the beginning of the video, like, why would I even care about the ars dictaminis in Italy during, I don't know, the 11th to the 13th century? Well, but obviously, because it's something beyond that to the 14th, and say, because of course these are the same issues that we're living today, that there is nothing abstract about this, there's nothing secluded from the world, from reality, right? There is nothing of the irrationality that you think of the Middle Ages as a moment of impulsive instincts and of strange kind of mystical subjectivism. There's none of that. These people were legitimately believing in truth. Moral relativism was chastised, was properly removed from all the equation. People were trying to make the world traditional, universal, Catholic, imperial, Roman, and they were doing so because they knew what that meant, which is what we don't do today. And this is the whole freaking point of it all, right? So from this point onwards, you see that literally the development also of these dictatores. For example, some city council paid masters of rhetoric in parallel. So it was not just about writing, it was just about being able to communicate in the first place. Consider that from the second half of the 13th century, the Italian communes take on properly a statal profile. This start becoming properly to be real states, not just sums of guilds of some sort, that really develop some central institutions within the commune that really start controlling, by the way, a much larger amount of land and people. That is to say, of course, you needed such professional figures ever more and more, right? And for example, there is a beautiful phrase that really tells you what these people were about, that is stemming from the justification that Bologna in 1321 gave of such choice expressing the positive, right? That the role that in the communal life was recognized to the ars dictaminis and to rhetoric, both oral and written one, and that is to say the supporting the sphere of communal welfare, right? Communal good, right? Because they said, quote, "Without rhetoric, cities and peoples cannot survive." In other words, you have to learn how to make sense. You cannot keep the world together in the universal way if people are not able to speak or to write correctly. I mean, just look at stats about literacy today in countries that have compulsory education pretty much everywhere in the world, that are supposed to be much more centralized than in medieval times, that have also much greater ease basically to school masses, and see how many illiterates we still have, or functional illiterates fundamentally, so people that don't even know, say, when the War of American Independence existed by living in the US. And we're not talking about just, say a ghetto person or whatever. We're talking about, the average guy that you would think this guy at least, he has gone to school for more than a decade in his life, and they literally don't know a fuck about anything anymore. Or I can make the example of the US, I can speak for Europe as well. In the West, we are the best in general, but we still suck. Just think about this in the rest of the world. I mean, again, in my university, once we have a Chinese exchange student that literally asked my tutor what was religion because she had never heard the word of it. Right? So when you understand these things, you truly understand the dimension of how relevant, right, in this case from a world like the late medieval one, where you didn't even technically have a state yet, or something like the state as source of law for the countries of civil law, and or properly a fixed compass, right, say, for which you could orientate yourself juridically, and see what these people built. Again, there wasn't such a thing before. Eventually civilization kept on building on this, and that's how we arrived to it. Still civilization standing on its feet, right? Consider what it is the case today, right? At best, I'm not saying that civilization is necessarily to collapse anytime soon just because there are ignorant people. What I'm saying is that this is the fact that the people will come back to a state where they will not be able to have powers, rights, whatever, is fundamentally obvious, right? Considering what we're experiencing nowadays. I mean, given that we talk so much about rights, even about things that are completely irrelevant, that probably we have decided to put on the floor because of boredom. Right, just think about the fact that in this very moment, especially those people who are more noisy about that, who actually believe that they're just superstitiously being carried away by it, are the ones who are de facto already in a servile dimension. I mean, if you're an average person, you already depend on someone. There's already somebody big that is paying for you, that you are within the clientele of, and that you factually do not have not much the power of freeing yourself from, let's say, of becoming independent, because it's not necessarily a negative thing, but that you in fact do not want to emancipate yourself from, to separate yourself from, to bail out from, because simply you think you're too weak. You want somebody else to take care of you in that form, to be maintained parasitically and just not doing much, like living a pretty mediocre life, but just at least living it because you've been told that the only values that matter is the ones of radical moral subjectivism. So whatever the fact you want to do, without thinking at all about the fate of civilization, you just do, including convincing yourself in bullshit such as the fact that we would be allegedly overpopulated or climate change will kill us all in I don't know, in 5 years, and all this kind of mental diseases that the average person literally believes, including, I don't know, just look at, it's not even just about leftism. Leftism is mostly nationalism and socialism always overlap. Actually, they all get down to communism, because it's always about the presumption of standardizing yourself on the base of some average level, which of course always sucks, but it's just, I'm a far right wing, but it's just like you're not a hero if you oppose yourself to COVID vaccination, right? That's the point. That is not the thing that makes you a hero. This makes you just a lame fourth estater who basically has nothing better to do in their lives than, against this terrible threat of, complaining on the internet about it and thinking to be saving the world, where he's being simply steamrolled by whoever wants to do whatever the fuck they want, right? So that's the actual level of, also as far as alleged conservatism of the actual thing. It's just a bunch of national socialists, right? Nationalists and or socialists, and more often than not the same thing at the same time, even if most people, of course, do not have the intellectual tools of understanding what that actually even means. But that's exactly the point. They understood at the time that this was the case. In fact, when the crisis kicked in, those who were down were fucked, right? And they would remain so for a good half of a millennium afterwards. So always bear in mind, in this sense, what actually history serves the purpose of, right? You're not, first of all, never a better person than those who lived before then. You have been told so because, again, the sport of the fourth estaters today, the new fourth estater religion, is pretending that you have any quality of worth or dignity just because you exist, which is exactly Satanism, just by definition. And in any case, history doesn't really leave any doubt about the fact that the people never ruled in any historical reality, and that the only way to be something is to be maybe at least a bit better than the average, which when you start seeing the average pretending to be, you realize it's still not what they actually are, and becomes just self-flattery and nothing else. In any case, I hope that this video was interesting. If you enjoyed it, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. We'll keep talking about these topics here and there. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.